In the quiet countryside of Norfolk, where morning mist dances across ancient fields and centuries-old secrets whisper through the trees, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Just a stone's throw from the grand gates of Anmer Hall, where royalty once found solace away from the world's watchful eyes, a simple conversation between neighbors would spark a chain of events that would touch hearts across the nation. It wasn't the kind of story that would make front-page headlines or cause a social media frenzy. Instead, it was the kind of tale that reminded people why they still believed in the magic of dreams coming true, even in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin not with grand announcements or royal proclamations, but with a single moment of human connection that ripples outward like stones thrown into still water. This is the story of how one couple's quiet determination, combined with the gentle support of their most famous neighbors, would transform not just their own lives, but the lives of an entire community. It's about the dreams we carry in our hearts, the courage it takes to pursue them, and the unexpected places where hope can bloom. Sarah Mitchell had always been an early riser, but this particular March morning found her awake even before the first birds began their dawn chorus. She stood at the kitchen window of their modest cottage, watching steam rise from her cup of tea while her thoughts wandered to the conversation she and her husband James had shared the night before. The same conversation they'd been having for months, actually, though neither wanted to admit they were going in circles. The cottage they rented sat on the edge of the Sandringham estate, close enough to Anmer Hall that Sarah could sometimes glimpse the morning joggers who used the private paths. She'd grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of life here, far removed from the hustle and bustle of London where they'd lived before James lost his job at the marketing firm. That had been 8 months ago, and while the redundancy package had kept them afloat, wouldn't last much longer. James appeared in the doorway, his hair still messy from sleep, wearing the old university sweater that Sarah had tried unsuccessfully to convince him to throw away for years. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they both looked out at the misty fields. "Still thinking about it?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Sarah nodded, leaning back into his warmth. "I keep wondering if we're being completely mad. I mean, who are we to think we could actually pull this off?" They were discussing was a small farm shop and cafe that had been their shared dream since they first met at agricultural college 15 years earlier. They'd talked about it through their wedding planning, during late nights when James worked overtime in London, and especially during the long months after his redundancy when they'd had nothing but time to imagine what their lives could look like if they were brave enough to take the leap. The opportunity had presented itself quite by accident. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly woman who owned a small plot of land adjacent to their cottage, had mentioned in passing that she was considering selling. The land wasn't much, just 2 acres with an old barn that had seen better days, but Sarah's mind had immediately begun spinning with possibilities. Fresh vegetables grown in their own soil, homemade preserves, local honey, perhaps even a small cafe where visitors could stop for proper coffee and Sarah's famous scones. "The numbers work," James said, echoing the spreadsheet calculations they'd gone over dozens of times. "Barely, but they work. And Eleanor said she'd give us a good price because she likes the idea of keeping the land in use rather than selling to developers." Sarah turned in his arms, studying his face. James had the kind of steady, dependable features that had first attracted her to him, but lately she'd noticed new lines around his eyes, the result of months of job applications and rejections. The redundancy had shaken his confidence more than he wanted to admit, and Sarah knew that part of his enthusiasm for the farm shop came from a desire to build something that couldn't be taken away by corporate restructuring. "There's something else," Sarah said, hesitating. She'd been debating whether to mention the encounter she'd had 3 days earlier while walking their neighbor's dog. James raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something else?" "I ran into them. The couple from Anmer Hall. They were out walking with their dog, and Charlotte got tangled up with theirs." Sarah felt herself blushing slightly at the memory. She'd been mortified when Charlotte, The energetic spaniel she was pet-sitting for Mrs. Hartwell had bounded over to investigate the two strangers and their perfectly behaved Labrador. "You mean the prince and princess?" James's eyes widened slightly. Even after living near the estate for almost a year, they still felt a bit surreal about having such famous neighbors. "They were so normal," Sarah continued. "She helped me untangle the leads, and we got to talking. I mentioned that we were thinking about starting a farm shop, and she seemed genuinely interested. She asked about local produce and said how nice it would be to have somewhere nearby to get fresh vegetables and proper coffee." James was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Did she say anything else? "She mentioned that they often have visitors who stay at Anmer Hall, and that a good local cafe would be perfect for showing guests around the area. Nothing concrete, mind you, but..." Sarah trailed off, not wanting to read too much into what might have been simple politeness. "But it sounds like there might be interest from some fairly high-profile potential customers." James finished with a small smile. The truth was, both of them had been looking for a sign, some indication that their dream wasn't just wishful thinking. Sarah had studied agricultural business at university before getting sidetracked into teaching, and James's background in marketing could certainly be useful in building a customer base. They had savings, though not much, and the redundancy package would cover the initial investment if they were careful. What they didn't have was certainty. Starting a business was risky under the best circumstances, and these weren't exactly the best circumstances. But as Sarah stood in their kitchen, watching the sun finally break through the morning clouds and illuminate the fields where she could imagine rows of vegetables and herbs, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Genuine excitement about the future. "Let's do it," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. James blinked. "Really? You mean really do it? I mean, let's call Eleanor today and tell her we want to make an offer. Let's stop talking about it and start doing it." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and nervous energy. Eleanor Hartwell, who was 83 and sharp as a tack, invited them over for tea and what she called proper negotiations. Her cottage was even smaller than theirs, filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life, and she served them Earl Grey in delicate china cups while they discussed terms. "I'll be honest with you," Eleanor said, settling into her favorite armchair with a slight grunt. "I've had 3 other inquiries about the land. 2 from developers who want to build executive homes, and 1 from a man who wants to start some sort of glamping business." Sarah's heart sank. They couldn't compete with developers, not financially. Eleanor continued, "But I'm not interested in any of that nonsense. I want to see the land used properly, the way it was meant to be used. My late husband grew vegetables there for 40 years before his arthritis got too bad. He always said the soil was some of the best in the county. We want to honor that," James said earnestly. "We're not looking to make a fortune. We just want to grow good food and create something positive for the community." Eleanor studied them both over her teacup, her pale blue eyes still sharp despite her age. "The couple from the hall stopped by yesterday," she said casually, and Sarah nearly choked on her tea. "They did?" Sarah managed to ask. "Indeed. Seems you made quite an impression during your dog-walking adventure. They asked if I knew anything about your plans for the land." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of amusement in her voice. James and Sarah exchanged glances. "What did you tell them?" James asked. "I told them the truth. They are good people who love this community and want to contribute to it. That you have the knowledge and skills to make a success of farming, and that you're not just looking for a quick profit." Sarah felt her cheeks burning. The idea that their royal neighbors had been discussing their business plans was both thrilling and terrifying. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. They seemed quite pleased by the idea. Mentioned something about how nice it would be to have local suppliers for their entertaining, and how visitors always ask where they can get a proper taste of Norfolk. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. Sarah realized she was holding her breath. "So," Eleanor continued, reaching for a manila folder on the side table, I've prepared a purchase agreement that I think you'll find fair. The price reflects what I believe the land is worth for agricultural use, not development. In return, I want to promise that you'll keep it agricultural for at least 10 years. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the documents. The price was exactly what they hoped for, possibly even a bit less. There's one more thing, Eleanor added, and Sarah braced herself for the catch. I'd like to retain a small corner of the land, just enough for a little garden of my own. I'm too old to manage 2 acres, but I'm not ready to give up growing my own tomatoes entirely. Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. Of course, she said quickly. We'd love to have you as our neighbor. Maybe you could even help us with advice. Eleanor's stern expression softened into a genuine smile. I like that very much. They spent the next 2 hours going through the paperwork, discussing soil conditions, water rights, and the various challenges they'd face in their first growing season. Eleanor proved to be a wealth of knowledge, sharing stories of her husband's successes and failures, the best crops for their particular microclimate, and the local suppliers who could be trusted. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor walked them to the door, moving more slowly than Sarah had initially realized. You know, the older woman said thoughtfully, I haven't been this excited about something in years. It will be wonderful to see that land productive again. Walking back to their cottage, the signed agreement safely tucked in James's jacket pocket, Sarah felt as though she were floating. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields, and she found herself mentally dividing the space into growing areas, composting sections, and the spot where they'd eventually build the cafe. I can't believe we actually did it, James said, stopping suddenly in the middle of the path. We haven't done anything yet, Sarah replied, though she was grinning widely. We've just committed ourselves to the most challenging adventure of our lives. No, James said, pulling her into his arms and spinning her around. We've just taken the first step toward building our dream. That evening, they sat at their kitchen table with notebooks and laptops, making lists and plans and dreaming out loud. They calculated startup costs, researched local suppliers, and debated the merits of heritage tomatoes versus high-yield varieties. The conversation that had been going in circles for months suddenly had direction and purpose. Around 10 o'clock, as they were researching the licensing requirement for food service, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped when she read it. Hello, Sarah. This is Catherine from our dog walking encounter. Eleanor mentioned you're moving forward with your farm shop plans. William and I would love to chat about possibly sourcing some products locally when you're up and running. Would you be interested in coffee sometime next week? Nothing formal, just neighbors supporting neighbors. Sarah showed the message to James, who stared at it for a long moment before looking up at her with wonder in his eyes. I think, he said slowly, we might be onto something bigger than we imagined. As Sarah typed her enthusiastic reply, she couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The dream they'd carried in their hearts for so many years was finally taking shape, and apparently they had some very supportive neighbors indeed. The coffee meeting that Catherine had suggested turned into an afternoon that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. They met at a small cafe in the nearby village of Dursingham, a deliberately neutral location that felt less intimidating than either of their homes. Sarah had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear, finally settling on a simple blue dress that James assured her struck the right balance between respectful and not trying too hard. Catherine arrived exactly on time, dressed casually in jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like any other mother meeting a friend for coffee, except for the discreet security presence that Sarah tried not to notice lingering near the cafe entrance. Thank you for meeting me, Catherine said warmly as they settled into a corner table. I hope this doesn't feel too presumptuous. It's just that William and I are always excited to support local businesses, especially ones started by people who clearly care about the community. Sarah felt some of her nervousness evaporate. Catherine's genuine enthusiasm was infectious, And within minutes, they were chatting like old friends about everything from soil preparation to the challenges of starting a small business in rural Norfolk. The truth is, Catherine continued over a cappuccino, we're always looking for ways to showcase the best of East Anglia when we have official visitors or families staying at Anmer. There's something special about being able to serve produce that's literally grown down the road. Sarah found herself opening up about their vision in ways she hadn't expected. She described their plans for heritage vegetables, the small cafe where visitors could experience true Norfolk hospitality, and their hope of creating something that would benefit the entire community. We're not trying to compete with the big farm shops, Sarah explained. We want to offer something more personal, more connected to the land and the people who live here. James has all these ideas about storytelling and marketing, helping customers understand where their food comes from and how it's grown. Catherine's eyes lit up. That's exactly what we need more of. People are so disconnected from their food these days. There's something powerful about knowing the person who grew your carrots, don't you think? The conversation naturally turned to practical matters. Catherine mentioned that they frequently hosted family gatherings at Anmer Hall, informal occasions where they needed fresh, high-quality ingredients. She also talked about the various charitable events they supported in the area, many of which could benefit from local catering options. I don't want you to feel pressured, Catherine said carefully. But if you're interested, we could certainly help connect you with some of the local organizations we work with. The agricultural shows, the village festivals, that sort of thing. There's a whole network of people who would be excited to support a local farm shop. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer. That would be incredible, she said honestly. We're still figuring out so much, but knowing we have community support makes all the difference. As they talked, Sarah began to understand that this wasn't just about royal patronage or high-profile customers. Catherine and William were genuinely committed to supporting their local community, and they saw Sarah and James's venture as part of something larger, a movement towards sustainable, local food production that could serve as a model for other rural communities. There's one more thing, Catherine said as they prepared to leave. William mentioned that you might be interested in organic certification. It's quite a process, but there are resources available to help new farmers navigate it. If you're serious about pursuing that path, I could put you in touch with some experts. Sarah's mind raced. Organic certification had been something they discussed, but assumed was too complicated and expensive for a startup operation. Having guidance through the process could make it actually achievable. We would be so grateful for any help, Sarah said, meaning every word. Catherine smiled and pulled out her phone. Let me give you my personal number. Not for anything formal, just neighbor to neighbor. If you have questions or need advice as you get started, please don't hesitate to reach out. Driving home, Sarah felt as though she were living in a dream. Not because of the royal connection, though that was certainly surreal, but because of the genuine kindness and support she'd experienced. Catherine had treated her like an equal, someone whose dreams and ambitions mattered, and that meant more than any amount of money or publicity ever could. James was waiting anxiously at home, having spent the afternoon researching greenhouse suppliers and trying not to pace around their small living room. How did it go? He asked the moment she walked through the door. Sarah sank into their worn sofa, pulling him down beside her. It was incredible, she said, and then spent the next hour recounting every detail of the conversation. James listened with growing amazement, particularly when Sarah mentioned the potential connections to local events and the offer of help with organic certification. This changes everything, he said finally. Not just the business prospects, but the whole timeline. If we can get organic certification from the start, and if we have guaranteed customers for our first growing season, we could actually make this work, Sarah finished. Not just survive, but really succeed. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. They officially purchased Eleanor's land, spending a morning with solicitors and bank representatives that left them both exhilarated and terrified by the magnitude of what they'd committed to. Eleanor insisted on celebrating with champagne and plastic cups, while standing in the middle of what would soon become their vegetable garden. To new beginnings, Eleanor toasted, raising her cup toward the afternoon sun. To new beginnings, Sarah and James echoed, clinking their cups together and looking out over their land with a mixture of pride and panic. The next challenge was transforming their vision into reality. James threw himself into research mode, spending hours online learning about sustainable farming practices, business licenses, and health department requirements for food service. Sarah focused on the practical aspects, walking their land with Eleanor and mapping out growing areas, composting sites, and the eventual location of their cafe. The old barn that came with the property needed significant work, but the bones were good. Eleanor's late husband had maintained it well, and with some investment in roofing and electrical work, it could serve as both storage space and the foundation for their farm shop. "We'll need to phase the development," James said one evening as they reviewed their budget for the 100th time. "Start with just the growing operation this season, then build out the retail space over the winter, and add the cafe component next spring." It was a sensible plan, though Sarah could hardly contain her impatience to see the full vision realized. She'd already started a notebook filled with menu ideas and recipes, imagining the day when visitors could sit in their cafe, drinking coffee and eating scones made with eggs from their own chickens and jam from their own fruit. The first major milestone came when Catherine followed through on her promise to connect them with organic certification experts. Dr. Michael Reed, a soil scientist from the local agricultural college, arrived one morning to conduct a comprehensive assessment of their land. Dr. Reed was a thin, energetic man in his 50s who approached farming with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his work. He spent 3 hours walking their 2 acres, taking soil samples and asking detailed questions about their plans. "This is excellent growing soil," he confirmed, echoing what Eleanor's husband had always claimed. The previous agricultural use was minimal input, which puts you in a good position for organic certification. You'll need to document everything carefully for the next year, but it's definitely achievable. He also provided them with a detailed plan for soil improvement, crop rotation, and pest management that would meet organic standards. More importantly, he offered to mentor them through their first growing season, checking in monthly to ensure they were meeting all the requirements. "I have to say," Dr. Reed mentioned as he prepared to leave, "it's refreshing to see young farmers who are serious about sustainable practices. We need more operations like this in East Anglia." Sarah felt a flush of pride at being called a young farmer, though at 32, she wasn't sure she qualified for that description anymore. More significantly, she was beginning to realize that their little farm shop was becoming part of something much larger, a growing movement of people who believed in local food, sustainable agriculture, and community connection. The validation continued when they attended their first Norfolk Agricultural Association meeting, invited by one of Catherine's contacts. Sarah had been nervous about walking into a room full of established farmers who might view them as naive city transplants playing a country life. Instead, they were welcomed with genuine enthusiasm. Tom Harrison, a third-generation farmer who ran a large operation near Kings Lynn, immediately launched into a discussion of local varieties that grew well in their microclimate. "You're smart to start small," Tom said over coffee and biscuits after the formal meeting. "Too many people try to do everything at once and end up doing nothing well. Build your reputation with a few crops you can grow perfectly, then expand gradually." Margaret Westfield, who ran a successful pick-your-own operation, offered to share suppliers for seeds and equipment. "We small farmers need to stick together," she said with a conspiratorial wink. "The big operations have their advantages, but we can offer something they can't: personal service and genuine care for our customers." By the end of the meeting, Sarah and James had invitations to visit 3 different farms, contact information for trusted suppliers, and offers of help from experienced farmers who remembered what it was like to be starting out. Driving home, James shook his head in amazement. "I expected competition and suspicion," he said. "Instead, we found a whole community of people who want to help us succeed." It's because we're doing this for the right reasons, Sarah replied. We're not trying to get rich quick or put anyone out of business. We just want to grow good food and serve our community. The community support became even more evident when word began to spread about their venture. Mrs. Patterson from the village post office stopped Sarah in the street to ask when they'd be selling vegetables. The vicar mentioned their farm shop during Sunday announcements, asking parishioners to support the new local business. Even the proprietor of the existing farm shop in the next village over, rather than viewing them as competition, offered advice on dealing with suppliers and regulatory requirements. There's room for all of us, explained Henry Morrison, whose family had run Morrison's farm shop for 3 generations. People are hungry for local food, literally and figuratively. The more of us they're offering quality local produce, the better it is for everyone. As April arrived and the soil began to warm, Sarah and James finally began the physical work of transforming their dream into reality. They started with Eleanor's guidance, preparing beds for their first plantings of early potatoes, onions, and lettuce. Working side by side in the soft spring earth, Sarah felt a satisfaction she'd never experienced in any office job. Her hands were dirty, her back ached, and she'd never been happier. This was what they'd been meant to do, she realized, even if it had taken them 15 years to find their way to it. James, who had worried about trading his corporate career for manual labor, discovered that he loved the physical aspect of farming almost as much as the business side. There was something deeply satisfying about planting seeds and knowing that with proper care, they would grow into food that would nourish their neighbors. "Look at this," James said one evening as they admired their first planted rows. "A month ago, this was just empty field. Now we're actually farmers." Sarah laughed, wiping soil from her cheek and probably making it worse. "We're actually farmers," she agreed, and the words felt like a prayer of gratitude. The real test of their community support came when they needed help preparing the barn for use as their farm shop. James had been dreading the cost of hiring contractors, but when Tom Harrison heard about their timeline challenges, he organized what he called a proper barn raising. On a Saturday morning in late April, Sarah and James arrived at their land to find a small army of neighbors, fellow farmers, and volunteers ready to work. Tom had brought his tools, and truck Margaret Westfield arrived with sandwiches and thermoses of tea, and even Dr. Reed showed up in work clothes, ready to help with the renovation. Eleanor, despite her age, stationed herself in a lawn chair as the self-appointed supervisor, directing operations with the authority of someone who'd been involved in barn raisings for decades. "The roof needs attention first," she called out, pointing with her walking stick. "No point doing interior work if it's going to get rained on." By the end of the day, they'd made more progress than Sarah had dared hope. The roof was repaired, the electrical system was updated to code, and the interior space was cleaned and ready for fitting out as a proper shop. More importantly, Sarah realized as she looked around at their dirt-smudged, exhausted volunteers sharing a celebratory drink, they'd found their community. These weren't just potential customers or business connections. They were neighbors who believed in what Sarah and James were trying to build. As the sun set over their land, casting golden light across the freshly planted rows and newly renovated barn, Sarah felt a deep sense of contentment. The dream that had lived in their hearts for so long was finally taking concrete form, supported by a community they were proud to be part of. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they watched their volunteers pack up their tools. "I'm thinking we're exactly where we're supposed to be," Sarah replied, leaning into his warmth and watching Eleanor slowly make her way back to her cottage, looking as satisfied as if she'd done all the heavy lifting herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, seeds to plant, systems to organize, and 1,000 details to manage before they could open their doors to customers. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of community support and their own hard work, Sarah allowed herself to believe that their dream was going to succeed beyond their wildest expectations. The morning of their grand opening dawned gray and drizzly, The kind of May weather that made Sarah question every optimistic decision she'd ever made. She stood in the doorway of their newly completed farm shop at 6:30 in the morning, watching raindrops streak down the windows and wondering if anyone would brave the weather to visit their little venture. "Second thoughts?" James asked, appearing behind her with 2 cups of coffee and the slightly manic expression he'd worn for the past week. "Third and fourth thoughts," Sarah admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "What if no one comes? What if everyone comes and we're completely unprepared? What if our vegetables taste terrible? What if we stop spiraling and remember that half the village has been asking when we're opening?" James interrupted gently. "Mrs. Patterson has been calling every day to reserve the first jar of Eleanor's strawberry jam. Tom Harrison's bringing his entire family. Margaret Westfield is sending customers our way from her farm." Sarah knew he was right, but knowing didn't stop the butterflies performing acrobatics in her stomach. They'd worked for 2 months to get everything ready. The shop fitted out with locally made wooden shelves, the cafe area furnished with mismatched tables and chairs that somehow looked perfectly coordinated, and their first harvest arranged in baskets with handwritten signs describing each variety. Eleanor had insisted on contributing her famous preserves and pickles, and had spent the previous week teaching Sarah her closely guarded recipe for piccalilli. The older woman had become an unofficial partner in their venture, offering advice, sharing stories with customers, and generally being the grandmother figure that made everyone feel welcome. "The rain's stopping," James observed, and indeed, the clouds seemed to be thinning, allowing glimpses of blue sky that filled Sarah with cautious optimism. By 8 o'clock, they were as ready as they'd ever be. The till was loaded with change, the coffee machine was heated up, and Sarah's first batch of scones, made with eggs from their newly acquired chickens and flour from a mill just 10 miles away, were cooling on racks. Their first customer arrived at exactly 9 o'clock when they officially opened. Sarah was surprised to see Dr. Reed from the Agricultural College, dressed in his weekend clothes and carrying what appeared to be a congratulatory bottle of wine. "Couldn't miss the grand opening," he said warmly, looking around the shop with obvious approval. "This is exactly what rural Norfolk needs. Mind if I'm your first official customer?" He selected a variety of vegetables, a jar of Eleanor's jam, and insisted on trying one of Sarah's scones with a cup of coffee in the cafe area. His enthusiastic approval of the scone and his animated conversation with Eleanor, who had appointed herself official greeter, helped settle Sarah's nerves considerably. By 10 o'clock, a steady stream of visitors was flowing through their doors. Tom Harrison arrived with his promised family contingent, including his teenage daughter, who immediately fell in love with their chickens and asked intelligent questions about organic feed. Margaret Westfield sent 3 customers over from her pick-your-own operation, along with a beautiful bouquet of flowers and a note wishing them success. The real test came when Mrs. Patterson arrived with what appeared to be half the village in tow, all eager to see what the London couple had accomplished with Eleanor's old land. Sarah watched nervously as the local women examined their produce with the critical eyes of people who'd been buying vegetables for decades. "These courgettes are beautiful," pronounced Mrs. Henley from the Women's Institute, hefting one with the expertise of someone who grew her own. "Proper size, good color. You could tell they've been picked at just the right moment." "The lettuce is lovely too," added her companion. "None of that limp nonsense you get at the supermarket. This was probably growing in the ground this morning." "Yesterday evening, actually," Sarah said, unable to hide her pride. "We pick everything as close to opening time as possible." The approval from these discerning customers felt like earning a degree in farming. These women had been gardening and cooking since before Sarah was born, and their standards were exacting. If her vegetables passed their inspection, she could be confident in their quality. The morning flew by in a blur of customers' conversations, and the constant surprise that people genuinely seemed to love what they created. Sarah found herself telling the story of their journey again and again, how they'd left London, met Eleanor, connected with Catherine, and learned from the community of local farmers who'd become their mentors. Each telling reinforced her sense of how many people had contributed to their success. This wasn't just Sarah and James's dream anymore. It was a community project that reflected the values and aspirations of everyone who'd supported them. Around noon, Sarah was refilling the lettuce display when she noticed a familiar figure examining their selection of herbs. Catherine was dressed casually in jeans and a light jacket, browsing the shop like any other customer while trying to maintain a low profile. Sarah approached nervously, still not quite accustomed to having royal neighbors. "Catherine, how lovely to see you. What do you think?" Catherine's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Sarah, this is absolutely wonderful. You've created exactly what this community needed. The atmosphere is perfect, welcoming but not precious, local but not parochial." She selected an impressive variety of vegetables and herbs, explaining that she was planning a family dinner for the following evening. "William's parents are visiting, and I want to show off the best of Norfolk. Everything looks so fresh and beautiful." As Sarah rang up the purchase, Catherine mentioned casually, "We're hosting a small garden party next month for some local charities. Nothing too formal, but we like to showcase local businesses when we have events. Would you be interested in providing some of the refreshments?" Sarah nearly dropped the till receipt. "You mean catering? For a royal garden party?" "Just neighbors helping neighbors," Catherine said with a smile. "Though I should warn you, William's quite particular about his scones. He'll be expecting them to meet the same standard as these." She held up the bag containing 2 of Sarah's scones that she'd purchased for later. After Catherine left, James appeared at Sarah's elbow, having witnessed the entire conversation. "Did that really just happen?" he asked quietly. "I think we just got our first major catering commission," Sarah replied, feeling simultaneously thrilled and terrified. The afternoon brought a different kind of validation when several customers mentioned that they'd driven considerable distances to visit the shop. A couple from Norwich explained that they'd heard about the farm shop through friends and wanted to support local organic farming. A family from Cambridge was making a day trip to the Norfolk coast and had specifically planned their route to stop by. "We've been looking for somewhere that offers the complete experience," explained the mother, watching her children pet the chickens while her husband chatted with Eleanor about traditional farming methods. Not just shopping for vegetables, but understanding where food comes from and meeting the people who grow it. Sarah realized that they'd tapped into something larger than local demand. People were hungry for authentic connections to their food and the land it came from. Their farm shop wasn't just selling vegetables. It was offering an experience, a story, and a connection to something real in an increasingly artificial world. The day's biggest surprise came around 3 o'clock when a sleek black car pulled up outside the shop. Sarah watched through the window as an elegantly dressed woman in her 60s stepped out, followed by a younger man carrying a professional camera. "Oh dear," Eleanor murmured, appearing at Sarah's shoulder. "That's Miranda Ashworth from Norfolk Life magazine. I may have mentioned to her daughter that something interesting was happening here." Miranda Ashworth introduced herself as the editor of the county's most prestigious lifestyle publication and asked if she could interview Sarah and James about their venture. The photographer, she explained, was documenting the revival of small-scale farming in Norfolk, and their story fit perfectly with the magazine's focus on local entrepreneurs. The impromptu interview lasted nearly an hour, with Miranda asking thoughtful questions about sustainable farming, community building, and the challenges facing small rural businesses. She seemed particularly interested in their connection to the local farming community and the support they'd receive from neighbors. "This is exactly the kind of story our readers want to hear," Miranda explained as the photographer captured images of their vegetable displays and cafe area. "People are tired of faceless corporate agriculture. They want to know the farmers who grow their food, and they want to support businesses that reflect their values." As a magazine team prepared to leave, Miranda handed Sarah her card. "The article will run in our summer issue, which comes out in 3 weeks. I think you'll find it brings quite a bit of interest to your business." By the time they closed at 5 o'clock, Sarah and James were exhausted but euphoric. They'd served over 60 customers, sold nearly everything they'd harvested for opening day, and receive enough positive feedback to fuel their confidence for months. Eleanor helped them count the day's takings. Her practiced calculating totals while Sarah and James cleaned up the cafe area and restocked displays for the following day. Well, Eleanor announced finally, looking up from the cash register, "You've taken in more today than my husband's vegetable stall earned in a typical month 40 years ago." Adjusting for inflation, of course. The financial success was gratifying, but Sarah found herself more excited by the connections they'd made. Customers had lingered to chat about farming methods, share family recipes, and ask when specific vegetables would be ready for harvest. Several had signed up for their weekly newsletter, and at least a dozen had expressed interest in the CSA program they were planning to launch for the following growing season. "We've actually done it," James said as they walked through their shop one final time, turning off lights and double-checking that everything was secure for the night. "We've created something real." Standing in their cafe area, surrounded by empty tables where customers had spent the afternoon enjoying coffee and conversation, Sarah felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The dream that had lived in their hearts for so long was no longer a dream. It was a thriving business that served their community and reflected their values. "What's next?" she asked James as they walked hand in hand back to their cottage, tired but too keyed up to consider sleep. "Well, we have vegetables to harvest tomorrow, the Catherine's garden party to plan for, and apparently a magazine article that might bring us more attention than we're prepared for," James replied. "Oh, and Eleanor mentioned that the local primary school wants to organize field trips to learn about sustainable farming." Sarah laughed, realizing that success brought its own challenges. "And here I was worried that no one would show up." As they reached their cottage, Sarah paused to look back at their farm shop, its windows dark now, but promising to be full of activity again tomorrow. Beyond it, their vegetable rows stretched out in neat lines, with Eleanor's cottage glowing warmly in the distance. The community they'd found here, the dream they'd built, and the life they'd created felt as solid and nourishing as the soil beneath their feet. They were no longer the uncertain couple who'd left London with more hope than plans. They were farmers, business owners, and valued members of a community that had embraced their vision and helped make it a reality. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah said as they reached their front door. "What's that?" "This is just the beginning. Tomorrow we start planning the next phase, the next dream, the next way to serve our community and grow something beautiful." James kissed her forehead, tasting the salt of honest work and the sweetness of success. "I can't wait to see what we build next." Inside their cottage, as they shared a simple dinner made with vegetables from their own land, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From redundancy and uncertainty to this moment of quiet triumph, they discovered that dreams weren't just about personal fulfillment. They were about finding your place in the world and contributing something meaningful to the lives of others. The phone rang as they were finishing dinner, and Sarah smiled when she saw Eleanor's name on the caller ID. "Just wanted to make sure you two were properly celebrating," the older woman said without preamble. "Today was quite remarkable, you know. My husband would have been so proud to see the land used this way again. We couldn't have done any of this without you, Eleanor," Sarah said sincerely. "Thank you for believing in us when we barely believed in ourselves." "Nonsense," Eleanor replied briskly, though Sarah could hear the smile in her voice. "You two had the vision and the courage. I just provided the opportunity. Now get some rest. You have customers to serve tomorrow, and I suspect many more in the weeks to come." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that Eleanor was right. Today had been remarkable, not just for what they'd accomplished, but for how many people had been part of making it happen. Their dream had become a community dream, and that made its success even sweeter. Looking out their kitchen window toward the lights of Anmer Hall in the distance, Sarah felt a deep gratitude for the unexpected turns that had led them here. From a chance encounter with royal neighbors to the generous support of local farmers. From Eleanor's wise guidance to the enthusiasm of customers who become friends, every piece had fitted together to create something more beautiful than they could have imagined alone. The dream that had once seemed impossibly distant was now their daily reality. And tomorrow they would wake up as the successful farmers and business owners they'd always hoped to become. In Norfolk, in this community, in this life they'd built with their own hands and the help of neighbors who'd become family, they found not just success but home.